coronavirus pandemic of 2020 that has shocked humanity out of its complacency that our political, economic, and cultural systems are immune or even resilient to an existential crisis. The pandemic that has worldwide killed over 900,000 people thus far has in fact exposed our profound vulnerability as a species. As many others have pointed out, it has magnified many of the systemic injustices and challenges confronting the global community. These include the fragility of our environment, the challenges to the world of work posed by the Fourth Industrial Revolution, growing economic inequality, and continued deep systemic discrimination and marginalization of groups on grounds of their race, gender, caste, nationality, and others. It has also exposed the weakness of many public health systems worldwide that have been eroded by neglect and underinvestment, and the lack of robust, comprehensive social protection systems. But the pandemic has also posed profound questions for the human rights norms and system that have been protected in a plethora of United Nations and regional human rights treaties, which states across the world ratified in the wake of the Second World War. Many of these human rights norms have also been enshrined in domestic constitutions, such as those of South Africa and India. What is the relevance and role of human rights in responding to a global public health crisis, such as the one the coronavirus has represented? Is it not more useful to rely on hard public health and economic policy data and policy making, rather than the vague and idealistic human rights norms? And in a time of economic and social crisis, is it not prudent to give governments the latitude and powers they need to deal effectively with the exigencies of the crisis, unburdened by onerous, time-consuming human rights obligations such as public participation, impact assessments, and judicial oversight of human rights? Moreover, does human rights law really provide us with the tools to respond to the current challenges we face as humanity, such as global heating, poverty, and the jaw-dropping global wealth inequalities, where, as Oxfam notes, the richest 1% of the world's population has twice as much wealth as 6.9 billion people on the planet, and 22 of the richest men in the world have more wealth than all the women in Africa combined. In his book, Not Enough: Human Rights in an Unequal World, Samuel Moyn argues that a neoliberal economic paradigm has come to dominate world economic systems since the 1970s, and that in fact human rights norms have been powerless to stem the tide of inequality and the dismantling of the social protections of the welfare state that have followed in its wake. Indeed, it is those who these very neoliberal economic policies have marginalized and cast into deepening economic precarity that have borne the brunt of the coronavirus pandemic. These include the millions of informal sector workers whose livelihoods were suddenly brought to an end when lockdown measures were adopted. The migrant workers whose jobs came to an end and were stranded without social protection due to border closures. The over 1 billion of the world's population living in informal settlements and slums, for whom the advice to socially distance and engage in frequent hand washing must have sounded very hollow in the lack of such social facilities. And the women exposed to higher levels of domestic violence, as well as bearing the burden of childcare and caring for the sick and elderly. Indigenous people have also faced threats to their very existence as peoples. And it is also the poor and marginalized who have frequently borne the brunt of the heavy-handed law enforcement responses to enforce the emergency measures in many countries. My central argument in this lecture will be that human rights indeed speak to all these challenges and should be at the core of national and global responses to these problems. Firstly, it is worth returning to the values which are at the foundation of human rights norms: human dignity, equality, and freedom. Human dignity implies that each person is worthy of respect and entitled to the conditions of life consistent with human dignity. To quote one of our former esteemed Constitutional Court judges, Justice Yacoub, in the landmark case affirming a right to housing in the Constitution, the Grootboom case, where he said that the Constitution will be, and I quote, worth infinitely less than its paper if the reasonableness of state action concerned with housing is determined without regard to the fundamental constitutional value of human dignity. In short, he said, I emphasize that human beings are required to be treated as human beings. The preambles of the International Bill of Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights derive both sets of rights from the fundamental principle of the intrinsic dignity of the human person. Secondly, the value of equality implies that all human lives, regardless of race, gender, caste, nationality, sexual orientation, religion, ability, socioeconomic status, are equally valuable. A commitment to the value of human equality implies consistent efforts to reduce and eradicate systems of inequality on the grounds of status, distribution of income and wealth, and access to essential public goods and services such as healthcare, education, and social security. And finally, the value of freedom implies the right to make and exercise the choices and follow our own inner convictions and beliefs without arbitrary and unnecessary restrictions. It implies both negative and positive freedom, not simply the right not to be unduly restrained by state or private power, but also the right to conditions of life which make individual and communal self-determination truly possible. This conception of positive freedom aligns well with renowned Professor Amartya Sen's theory of human capabilities, which asks whether people have the opportunity to achieve valuable combinations of human functionings. All three of these fundamental values lie at the heart of human rights values, and they ensure that individual and collective well-being are the ultimate goals of economic and social policies, rather than the short-term pursuit of profits or powers. They can also guide us away from our current trajectory of environmental destruction, which is rendering life on Earth increasingly dangerous for current generations and threatens to make it uninhabitable for future generations. I turn next to examine more closely what human rights norms have to offer in how states respond to the coronavirus pandemic. And in doing so, I will draw on guidance provided by the UN human rights system before concluding with some reflections on the lessons the pandemic holds for responding to future crises. The first point I want to highlight is that in a crisis such as the one posed by the coronavirus pandemic, human rights norms assist us in priority setting. They direct our attention to those who are most vulnerable and disadvantaged and require us to prioritize the protection and fulfillment of their needs and rights. These are the groups whose rights are most imperiled in a crisis, and the identification requires careful contextual analysis and monitoring. I have already identified some of the groups that have been most severely impacted by the pandemic. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres noted in his report, COVID-19 and human rights, we are all in this together. The virus does not discriminate, but its impacts do. He reminded the international community that special measures of social protection must be taken for groups most at risk or disproportionately affected. He goes on to note that the response to the crisis needs to take into account multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and inequalities, including pervasive gender inequality. This is in line with a substantive equality paradigm that does not insist on formal equality of treatment for all, regardless of circumstances, but rather requires the state to take positive measures to ensure that in the end there can be equal political, economic, and social outcomes for all. This commitment to substantive equality will be even more important as the world copes with the economic fallout of the pandemic, which is triggering dramatic drops in GDP, looming recession, and sovereign debt crises faced by many countries. A substantive equality paradigm falls within the Build Back Better paradigm, which the UN and others have endorsed, which requires us to take into account that every life is valuable and should be equally prioritized in our responses to the pandemic. The second value that a human rights frame brings to the coronavirus pandemic is that of the interdependence of all categories of human rights: civil, political, economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. Collectively, these rights help to protect all dimensions of what it means to be human in community with others. Both set of rights complement and reinforce each other. Unfortunately, the neoliberal economic paradigm that Samuel Moyn has described has eroded many critical economic, social, and cultural rights globally, and has manifested in declining investments in public health, in education, in dignified work, and in robust social protection systems. The pandemic and the measures to curtail it have illuminated how neglect of these critical economic and social rights prior to the pandemic has reduced the ability and resilience of many countries in responding to it. As the Secretary General notes in his report, never before has the importance of the responsibility of governments to protect people by guaranteeing their economic and social rights been so clearly demonstrated. Yet there is another important lesson that will need to be learned when this is over. Countries that have invested in protecting economic and social rights are likely to be more resilient. Universal healthcare systems strengthens the ability of a country to contain a threat to public health, but so do effective food distribution systems, social security and protection systems, gender equality, protecting people and jobs through labor rights, minimum wages and paid sick leave, as well as health and safety in the workplace, including through personal protective equipment, the provision of affordable quality housing, well-resourced education systems able to quickly switch to distance learning and access to the internet. These rights need to be seen as an essential part of a prevention and preparedness strategy. But in addition to underscoring the vital importance of social and economic rights, the pandemic has also demonstrated their interconnection with traditional civil and political rights and liberties. In taking measures to contain the virus and curtail its transmission, many countries, including my own, have adopted exceptional disaster or emergency type measures that have limited or in some cases even completely suspended a range of civil and political freedoms, such as freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, amongst others. The enforcement of such measures has too often been accompanied by heavy-handed and militarized style enforcement mechanisms, and that it has been largely the poor in overcrowded informal settlements who have borne the brunt of such actions. This has led to the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, to criticize what she described as a toxic lockdown culture in many countries, which has impacted most drastically on society's most vulnerable members. In its statement on derogations from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the UN Human Rights Committee has noted that while states have a firm obligation to take measures to protect the right to health and of all the right to life of all individuals within their territory, and this could entail temporary limitations or even derogations from civil and political rights, that there are certain universal principles governing such limiting or derogating measures. These are the principles of legality, necessity, proportionality, non-discrimination, and respect for a core bundle of non-derogable rights, such as the right to life, the prohibition of torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, and of slavery or servitude, amongst others. The UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has also warned state parties against abuses of emergency powers adopted to curb the pandemic and called for the principles of necessity and proportionality to be respected. The principles of proportionality and the interdependence of all human rights are vital principles and safeguards against excessive restrictions on fundamental rights. But they are also valuable tools in helping us to balance between rights that might seem to be in tension with each other, such as, for example, the tension between the right to life on the one hand and the right to livelihoods on the other that has been so prominent in this pandemic. These principles require us to regard both as equally important and for states to seek to maximize both rights without inflicting a proportionate or long-term harm on the other. In other words, a failure to take adequate measures guided by the best scientific evidence available to protect life in the context of the pandemic on the pretext of preserving livelihoods or the economy would not represent a reasonable or proportionate response. Conversely, a failure to protect livelihoods by, for example, not putting in place mitigating measures such as social protection schemes, food distribution programs, and lifting economic restrictions as soon as they are no longer necessary, would also violate the principles of proportionality and the interdependence of rights. Civil and political freedoms, along with enabling rights such as access to information, play a critical role in preserving democratic space, building trust and legitimacy, which are critical to a sustainable recovery from the pandemic. The UN Committee on Economic and Social Rights has noted that accurate and accessible information about the pandemic is essential both to reduce the risk of transmission of the virus and to protect the population against dangerous disinformation. But it is also crucial in reducing the risk of stigmatizing harmful conduct against vulnerable groups, including those infected by COVID-19. Such information should be provided on a regular basis in an accessible format and in all local and indigenous languages. As the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights has noted, the best way to maintain public support for extraordinary measures that combating the pandemic may require is to be open and transparent and involve people in making the decisions that affect them. Securing compliance depends on building trust, and trust depends on transparency and people's participation. The next valuable tool that human rights provides us with in responding to the pandemic is the essential principle that no right is worth its name as a human right without an effective remedy. Remedies are key for accountability, and they are particularly important in situations where human rights are most at risk, such as in a crisis. Remedies, particularly administrative or judicial remedies, require effective access to justice, particularly for marginalized and vulnerable groups. The UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women have highlighted how important accessible remedies are for many women who, during lockdown measures, have been confined to their homes with abusive partners and family members and have struggled to be free from all forms of violence. And they have emphasized the role of effective access to justice for women in these situations, including through modern information and communications technology systems. An example of the important role that judicial remedies can play in a crisis is a recent case in South Africa where the High Court declared that the suspension of our school feeding program, which provides critical school meals to 9 million impoverished children in the school system in South Africa, the court found that the suspension of this program by government during the closure of the schools represented a breach of the constitutional rights of children's right to basic nutrition, as well as the right to education, because without effective nutrition, effective learning is impossible. And the court, in giving this judgment, relied on the principle of non-retrogression, which says that when rights have been afforded and extended, particularly economic and social rights, they should only be withdrawn in exceptional circumstances and in line with strict principles of proportionality and non-discrimination. It drew on this principle, which was developed by the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and has also been affirmed by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. The court ordered government to resume the school feeding program for all learners, regardless of whether or not they were in school, and undertook a continuing jurisdiction over the implementation of this order, which is ongoing at present. Such continuing jurisdiction or supervisory jurisdiction has many similarities to the Indian remedy of the continuing mandamus. The final principle that I want to touch on in this lecture, where I believe international human rights law offers important normative tools in coping with pandemics and crises, is the principle of international assistance and cooperation. This principle acknowledges what the coronavirus pandemic has thrown into stark relief: that we live in a globalized world where the fates and fortunes of all are inextricably connected. The virus does not respect national boundaries, and neither should our responses. As the UN Human Rights High Commissioner has noted, if one country fails in its efforts to control the spread of the virus, all countries are at risk. The world is only as strong as the weakest healthcare systems. In its recent statement on the coronavirus pandemic, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights emphasized the critical role of international assistance and cooperation, which includes the sharing of research, medical equipment and supplies, best practices in combating the virus, coordinated actions to reduce the economic and social impacts of the crisis, and joint efforts by states to ensure an equitable economic recovery. It called for the world community to prioritize the needs of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups and fragile countries, including least developed countries, countries in conflict and post-conflict situations, and called for them to be at the heart of the international response. As progress has been made globally towards a vaccine for the COVID-19 pandemic, international support and assistance, particularly in initiatives such as the COVAX initiative, are going to be critical to ensure that the benefits of such a vaccine are spread equitably and that fragile and underdeveloped countries can benefit from such vaccines. So in conclusion, I hope that I have succeeded in convincing you that human rights offer a value-based set of principles and methodologies for responding to and emerging better and more resilient from the current pandemic. The values of human rights law invite us to structure our political, economic, and social institutions so that they foster an ethos of care, social solidarity, egalitarianism, and respect for human agency. As such, they offer powerful tools to respond not only to the current pandemic, but also to other contemporary challenges I've mentioned, such as global economic inequality and environmental degradation. And yet, as the UN Secretary General has warned, the coronavirus crisis has come at a time when there has been considerable pushback by some against multilateralism and international cooperation, including against international human rights norms. Fulfilling the promise of human rights law will require a combination of new and inclusive forms of grassroots and civil society mobilization. It will require sympathetic states to stand up for human rights values and to support international and national bodies responsible for human rights monitoring and enforcement. And finally, it will require a fundamental reimagining of our political, social, and economic systems so that they can be aligned to the human rights values of human dignity, equality, and freedom. Human rights, crafted in the aftermath of a very dark period in human history, represent a precious achievement of the international community and humanity as a whole. In the current era of threats to multilateralism, unrestrained power politics, trade wars, and neoliberal economic policies, revitalizing the human rights agenda can infuse a much needed commitment to values in international relations and can help steer us away from our current unsustainable and inhumane development trajectory. I thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sandra. I think that was a wonderful presentation, giving us a great insight into how international organizations and instruments have dealt with human rights, especially during this pandemic. I think you have touched almost all issues that probably I could have conceived about. And from your writing and from your presentation, we have just immensely benefited from that perspective. Let me, if you permit me, give kind of a contextualization of what you presented in the Indian space. So that we get into a kind of a discussion with the participants on that. So my attempt will be only to reiterate what you have already done, but just giving some specific examples in the Indian context. I thought I could use a presentation, but that's fine. So the first thing, Professor Sandra, and this is just addressing to the participants, was about, India did have a great amount of challenge in the initial days about migrant workers. And, migrant workers, unfortunately, in India, do not have adequate security, especially in terms of that is employed in that sector. Second, when I look at education, which you rightly pointed out, interestingly, India has done pretty well with education because most of the schools have gone online. But if you look at some statistics which are unfortunately not reliable or available, there are more than 20 million children in every state in India who usually go to government schools or schools that cannot afford internet or online education. Yes, education is a matter of right now in the Constitution of India, especially in terms of primary education. It is a duty of the state. And the pandemic, unfortunately, has not successfully addressed the right to education of the numerous children who, unfortunately, do not get online education. So I think education is an important integral aspect to how India has dealt with the human rights in the pandemic. You rightly pointed out about our nutrition to the children in education, because most of these children who are going to government schools were getting what we call as the midday meal. They would get free meal in the school, so they did not have to actually search for that in the house, or if the parents cannot afford it, the school would provide it. Now I think the government has addressed some of these concerns by distributing free food. They have given grains at very affordable pricing to the families. And hence, I think while food was taken care of, education suffered. Uh, if I go further and just look at another interesting or most important observation, because yesterday was, I think, the World Suicide Day. Uh, India has unfortunately not been able to handle the mental well-being of its citizens. Because when I say health, it is a physical and mental well-being. India, unfortunately, has a very staggering rate of suicides. Both not so it's not only in the urban areas that suicide is a problem, but we have suicides in the rural areas as well. Farmers' suicide is a major problem in India, which we have not been able to handle or address, despite the best insurance mechanism that has developed in this country. So I think the lockdown has severely impacted mental health. And I think, this was basically because, people could not go out. There was no recreation available. Employment opportunities diminished. People lost their jobs. And I think if one looks at the statistics, we had some publication of that yesterday in a major newspaper in India. The statistics of the number of suicides that have happened in the country is alarming. This is something very shocking. I think when we talk about right to life, I think positivity of life is something that our population need to address and need to know. I think that was also something that we experienced during this pandemic. You did rightly pointed about transparency. I think we had a very interesting fund that was created by the government. It was created by the Prime Minister's office called Prime Minister Care Fund. This was an interesting case that went to the Supreme Court. I deal with some aspect of right to information, so I followed this case very, in detail, and I wrote about it. And I said, look, any fund that the government receives, it should have transparency. What is wrong? You show accountability when you receive people's money. You have to tell us where you spend, for what you spend. That's all is what is required, right? You have the right to receive money from the public, especially during a pandemic of such nature. The PM Care Fund was opened. But unfortunately, the PM Cares Fund was not accessible under the Right to Information law. And the courts, interestingly, to which you I'm quite pleased that you have great impression of the Indian judiciary. But yes, it does deserve the respect it has. But unfortunately, some of the Supreme Court judgments are simply not acceptable. The Supreme Court agreed with the government and said, "I think this need not come under the Right to Information Act." Right. So that also, in terms of transparency, I think we do have challenges in India, and I think we ought to take that quite seriously. Another issue that I could just flag off is on this very interesting app that was developed by the government. It was called the Arogya Setu app. I'm sure most governments, including South Africa, have this app that will track COVID-19 patients, or it would actually tell you whether you're positive, who is positive next to you, and so on and so forth. So most of us actually in our mobile phone have this app right now, and it's mandatory if you're traveling interstate, so on and so forth. We recently, a couple of years back, got the right to privacy as a fundamental right. It was declared by the Supreme Court. It was declared by 9 judges. We thought privacy was a right, but interestingly, during the pandemic, I think privacy has gone to a toss. The government is tracking you. Like Aarti was saying, Kerala has this very good tracking policy. I don't mind you tracking because yes, there is larger public interest that is involved. But tracking digitally, where you are, the Arogya Setu app actually tells you where you are. It surrounds you to whichever places you have actually gone. And I think the government, while having justified that kind of a tracking, has to take responsibility for the data. It has to see that the data is not shared with any third party. There has to be data security. And I don't think this data mining that probably any private individual company would be interested in should be permitted. Unfortunately, we do not have a law in India yet on privacy. It's just in the judgment of the Supreme Court. We do not have a confirmed statute or a legislation that provides that right. The last issue that I just want to flag off, and then I would just take a couple of minutes to give you the positive sides of it. The last issue on the pandemic and human rights in the Indian context was we saw a lot of, and I'm sure, while I was seeing a lot of international channels, it's not unique to India. We saw that in UK, we saw that in Italy and Spain as well. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, we lost, caregivers. Uh, you know, Parents unfortunately were left to look after themselves. Children couldn't visit parents. So the elderly people unfortunately were not taken care either by the society or by the government. So we had a lot of elderly families, parents, singles, individuals who couldn't have anybody next to them. Because there was this issue about where they will catch the virus. The elders were vulnerable, unfortunately, due to this virus, and hence the caregivers who are within the family actually abandoned some of the families. So we have some very interesting cases that were reported where the daughter could not go and meet the father. The father was left without any domestic help because domestic help stopped coming because they were fearful of contacting the virus. The nursing staff or the medical staff also stopped coming home. So a lot of the elderly community or the elderly population suffered during the pandemic. And I think as a nation and a country, we owe a great amount of responsibility to that kind of section in the society. Now, let me just, talk about a few things on the positive side. When I see the positive side, you did speak about domestic violence. And I was just looking at the kind of cases that are there in Australia. That is because we are doing a small project with the Australian National University on this topic. And Australia actually, during the pandemic, has reported very high number of cases on domestic violence. I think in India, there is a firm law on domestic violence, and to a larger extent, I think the law is working. So I think, because the law was brought into place, I think people now have some kind of security of right against domestic abuse. So that's a very positive sign that we saw during this pandemic. The second positive sign that we saw during this pandemic was the response to healthcare. I think the government did a fantastic job by making healthcare affordable, accessible, and available. The government intervened at the right place by giving, by capping the health cost of a COVID patient. So you can go private or you can go public. So we capped the price. So this is under this National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority, where drug prices and treatment costs were regulated. So the private healthcare sector could not go by the normal business during the pandemic. They had to do social service. They had to actually make healthcare far more affordable. So I think the government regulated the healthcare business as such, and saw that to a larger extent people were able to access the basic right to health. I think what was important during the pandemic also was the response of the government for certain kinds of disasters, which are not connected to the virus, but which the country faced during this pandemic time. Especially, we have faced unprecedented rainfall, the deserts in the western part of India unfortunately got flooded. So they were deserts, but they got flooded with water. This is a place called the Ran of Kutch. And I think the government did pretty well. Usually governments would come up with excuses of saying, oh, we are busy with the pandemic, hence we cannot probably take care of the flood victims. But the government in this case actually worked pretty well. And I think positively, the government did respond to the issues that were faced during these disasters. I think one interesting other aspect that I saw was how the government in India dealt with prisoners. When the initial time of the pandemic, we were quite anxious that the Indian prisons are overcrowded and the virus will, spread very rampantly there and cause quite an amount of, violation of human rights. But the government was very fast on releasing under trials. I remember the government of Maharashtra that said that, we have to decongest the Indian prisons. Only then, you will be able to control the virus in the prison. And I think the government did fantastically well over there in trying to decongest the prisons, releasing the under trials, and trying to see that the pandemic is controlled in that environment. So I think we have seen some positive reports coming from that as well. There was another positive intervention of the government where they tried to protect the rights of tenants. The government did release an interesting circular, and they said that during the pandemic, landlords cannot ask tenants to leave. That was an interesting game changer, I think, in India. This has never happened before. And a lot of states, especially if I can talk about Karnataka, Maharashtra, and some of the northern states, did implement this order. And they said to the landlords that, look, this is the time when there is a lockdown, there is a pandemic, you cannot ask your tenant to leave. Right? They have the right to stay. And in case, and I remember of a case where, I had to defend the landlord where he asked his tenant to leave. It was a paying guest accommodation and he did not know the law, and that's why he did it. But then the police actually threatened him to be arrested under the disaster management law because that notification of protecting the tenant was issued under that law. The pandemic also raised one interesting, issue, and the issue was on environment. Suddenly, you would see cities in India hearing the chirping of the birds, especially in Bangalore, which is a very noisy town. I think the environment got a little cleaner. We got cleaner air during the lockdown. And I think there were positive signs that, yes, it's not only about growth. If the growth is stopped for some time, I think the environment can get far more cleaner. So on the right to environment, I think we started experiencing better and cleaner air, at least in some cities, including Bangalore and in Delhi. The last point, and let me conclude by this. The interesting part of the pandemic was, I had a lot of people, especially international friends of mine, who always complained about internet speed in India, which is unfortunately not that great. But let me tell you, during the pandemic, this withstood. And I'm really happy because it was the Kerala High Court which said that right to internet is also a human right. Yes, we have a High Court which said that. Anyway, the context is not what we are speaking today, but they did declare it. And I think in India, especially in most of the urban areas, the government did really well withstanding the traffic from the internet. Because right now, if we speak, I think we need internet. So in terms of freedom of speech and expression, online communication and internet becomes very, very essential. And Indians are logging into online traffic pretty well. And I think to a larger extent, the government with telecommunication and internet facility actually tried to ensure this at some price, but I think there was no disruption, major disruption anywhere else. So I think these were some of the issues, challenges, some positives as well that we have taken in this country in the human right context in the pandemic. So I thought I will just add to that context so that the discussion that are going to come by with questions now can be raised before you. So let me now open this webinar for any questions that the participants may have. The organizer can decide whether the question should be on the chat box or can people unmute themselves.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Two excellent presentations, very exhaustively covered all the major aspects that we have to consider in this topic. Now the floor is open for questions and answers. You can directly post your questions in the chat box, or if you can raise your hand with the reaction box, I can unmute you if you want to directly ask the question. To begin with,
Dr. Bijula MV wants to ask the question, it seems.
Yes, yes, I can unmute him. Yes, sir. Bijulal, sir, you can. Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, yes, please go ahead.
No, I see. I was listening both the presentation and response, and it was actually a great learning experience to have Professor Sandra and some part of Professor Sairam Bhat explanation of especially his first 2 points, which I really appreciated very well. But I feel that I have a question precisely. Let me just go to the question first, and then I have 1 or 2 responses in this context. My question is to Professor Sandra in the sense that you were referring to Samuel Moyn about the concept of neoliberalism and the kind of situation and how human rights as a requiring value is mostly applicable to the entire world in the time of the COVID situation. And you referred that's very important. You referred to the South African High Court's decision on reinstating the basic rights program, which I find is the basis of my my kind of question. In India, there were at least 2 or 3 instances where labor rights were stopped by one by the Supreme Court and 2 by different courts in India, high courts in state high courts in India, which even runs to the fundamental violation of human rights of the time of labor, the minimum hours of work and things like that. The most striking thing is about a reference by the Supreme Court, which said that the pending wages of the workers, this is actually 3 months before, the pending wages of the workers is not a priority since they have food and shelter and things like that. I'm just pointing to this aspect. And this might be the case in many countries. Once you have a different and positive example of South Africa, I can at least cite you different, at least 7 or 8 instances of such violations by the floor of the judicial system. I was thinking that we have this systems where we are talking about rights-based approaches to human rights, and we are talking about keywords, and we are talking about fundamental applications of this. My whole idea is that should we really need a kind of social, a global civil society authority for evaluating the human rights processes at this time on a transnational basis. I would say this authority in the sense that it has to have a kind of collective appeal, and it has to have a collective kind of demonstrative power that this comes up. And that is where the transnational collaboration at the time of human rights is actually, situated. And especially when you are ending your talk, you have referred to a very precise kind of inhuman development, conditions. So
Excuse
my
me.
feeling
So,
is that,
let me
yeah, yeah,
intervene
this,
in this. Sir, can I request you to just be precise with your question? So you can raise
no,
the
my,
question and
my
we can
question is,
expect
my
Professor
question is
Sandra to
very,
respond instead of
yeah,
making
yeah,
an analysis. So
I
I
will,
request you to, please.
I will just make this precisely to the question is that my question is that how can we actually make a global uh, authority of civil actors to oversee country-wise processes in the legal and human rights manner and make regular assessments that marginalized people actually get their rights done. I hope it is communicated that this is what this is my question precisely. And
There's another question from Dr. Matthew Verghese. Probably we can take a couple of
Sandra, do
questions.
you want to take the questions together or one by one? Do you want to?
Maybe clustering them would be a good idea. Yeah.
Yes. Matthew, you can go ahead and ask the question. Matthew, if you can hear me, please unmute your mic and you can ask the question. If you're taking time, I have a question from Induja. Okay. Yes, Matthew, go ahead.
Oh, I hope I'm audible. Thank you, Professor Liebenberg, for such a holistic macro to micro take on human rights and grassroots context. I was wondering about the contemporary context that may not, within quotes, entirely new in effect, but rather exaggerate situations like that of most vulnerable. Here I'm more keen to know about South African scenarios, of which I could get a very basic glimpse of from Durban. If I take those groups represented by the Abali, like ABM movement, or the Kennedy Road like situations that really wanted to be talked to, that's one thing, and which probably have ever less chance now. And if I may also recall the way they joined with mainstream, like the DA in or against ANC and things like that. Also, in the context of South Africa, which is very special, I felt, because after 90s, so many things converged in South Africa, right? One is the reforms towards human rights. Second is the coming in of neoliberal pressures. So does such a process unfurl during exaggerated effects during COVID? That's one question. Second is, what do you think entails for such powerful movements from informal settlements in current scenario? Thanks a lot once again, Dr. Liebenberg.
Sandy, I have a question from Induja from Obo Academy in Finland. She asks that in many countries, for example, India is not part of the complaints procedure under the ICCPR and ICSCR optional protocols. In such a situation, how to bring the state to accountability under international human rights law mechanisms? Does it bring extra challenge during the pandemic emergency situations? We have three questions and three participants who are maybe you can take it now and wait for the other questions. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you very, very much. And thank you also, Professor Bhat, for your wonderfully rich contextualization of human rights in India. I think I will just pick up on one point that you raised before going to the specific questions, and that is on social protection for workers in the gig economy and informal sector. I mean, this is a huge issue in South Africa as well, with over 70% of our workers actually informal sector workers. And, you know, many of the relief programs for medium and large businesses were effectively not accessible to these businesses because of requirements that they had to have, you know, tax fax numbers, and they had to have certain formal documents. So this, I think, is a huge issue worldwide around, social protection schemes for the informal sector. And I would just recommend to you the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty has just yesterday produced a report on social protection schemes in the light of COVID and highlighting also the informal sector. I think, you're right to point out their positives. And in South Africa, some of these positives have been, for example, a special COVID grant of 350, which is paid to all who don't benefit from other social grants. Unfortunately, it's a time-limited measure. But we have seen that the Ministry of Social Development and Civil Society, the COVID pandemic has revitalized a debate in South Africa around a basic income grant. And I think this is something which is, going to be very important going forward, as a universal social protection scheme. So yes, I agree with that. So just to go to the specific questions, Bejulal's question about courts and then a global civil society forum. I am very much aware of the trajectory in India with your Supreme Court, and that, some have criticized that the golden era that all of us studied of public interest law, is maybe hasn't been perpetuated going forward. Certainly the South African court's responses has been interesting because although they've withstood or they've upheld all the government state of emergency regulations against challenges, they've also come in and been willing to grant relief where they felt the most vulnerable are not protected. So I've mentioned that school nutrition feeding program. Other examples is we also had similar measures saying no evictions could take place during the lockdown. Our courts have come in where local authorities have demolished shelters on the grounds that they were land invasions and sometimes quite brutally demolished them and said, no, that actually this is in violation of the lockdown and also principles of judicial oversight and so forth. So our courts have although they haven't set aside any macro level disaster type mechanisms, they have come in to support the most vulnerable in these situations. And yes, courts are difficult creatures, and they're not always the panacea. One has to look very carefully at their judgments and be prepared to critique them against, for example, universal standards as well being a basis to do that. The question of a global civil society forum, I think, is very interesting. The world is, of course, not there yet because we have a system of state sovereignty, and states are very much, the major players in the international arena. But I think, really, if we talk about a reimagining of human rights, we do need to start thinking about these global, cross-national, it's not new, of course, but we need to revitalize that. And just to say, within the UN systems, civil society movements do have an important voice in reviewing states' performances and so forth, and in criticizing them. So, I would just agree with the sentiment that we certainly need to think of, innovative ways of, relying on remedies. Don't all have to be judicial remedies, and accountability mechanisms can be civil society forums and other ways of achieving accountability. Matthew's question about the Abahlali movements in Durban, the so-called shack dwellers movements, and the ambiguities of South Africa's transition to democracy is very, well taken. And there is, of course, a very lively debate in South Africa around, a progressive constitution that enshrines justiciable economic and social rights, and yet what many have accused as being effectively neoliberal economic policies. And there's a lot of concern, for example, at the moment by movements like the Budget Justice Coalition, that the stimulus packages actually are not all that they made out to be, and that in effect we may be heading for an era of austerity and cutbacks in many areas. And the question of, well, what can human rights do in that scenario? What tools do they offer? This is very much a lively debate and a very live debate at the moment in South Africa. And then the question from Obo Academy about the non-ratification of the optional protocols, what happens when your domestic remedies run out, what sort of international remedies you would have when states are not obliged to ratify the optional protocol. So South Africa, for example, has ratified the optional protocol to the Civil and Political Covenant, but not yet the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Covenant. Unfortunately then, and I mean, this is the reality of, the weakness of international law, the only remedy then would be through the periodic state reporting system, which is a slow process, because states report every 4 years and the committee makes recommendations. We have now also made some short-term and follow-up mechanisms, but it's not a judicial mechanism, it's a reporting mechanism, but it also holds, depending on the extent of civil society mobilization, a lot of political soft enforcement power. So many states take into criticisms by the UN committees very seriously. They send high-level delegations, and you have many civil society formations that are very active in follow-up on that. But short of actually pushing for ratification of the optional protocols, there's not much more that can be done in terms of international human rights accountability. Thanks.
If there are any other questions, please, you can post in the chat box. In the meantime, I have a question to both the speakers today. I want to understand from both your perspectives, because during this pandemic, we saw that the distinction between the civil and political rights on one side and the economic, social, and cultural rights on the other side, it vanished. And we know that the economic, social, and political rights is in the limelight more than ever now, right? And with the ESC rights, we always hear terms like availability of resources, and the economic constraint also comes into the picture. But there is also this political constraint in the space, wherein the government, the democratically elected, or it's a legitimate body which runs the politics of the country, which decides budgetary allocations. Now, in light of the pandemic and how the governments are taking care of the health and the social security aspects of its people, do you see any possibility in future that the governments would allocate or reallocate resources more to the ESC rights, and rather than going into the priorities of a particular government every other term when it changes? I would like both your perspectives on this. I see no other hands raised or questions. Yes, Arati, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a after both the present listening to both of you, it's kind of a vicious circle which is forming in my mind. It's like from Professor Sandra's presentation, we got clearly that the socio-economic inequalities already existing in the world, which is actually disproportionately affecting the people. The pandemic is being affected disproportionately because of that too, the existing socio-economic inequalities. And the pandemic is further creating or further widening the gap and further, in a way, severizing the socio-economic inequalities. And the kind of measures the national states have been taken, which has made the people, poor people, socio-economically backward people's life even more worse. And that is create how do we deal such situation where the pandemic is all creating a disadvantaged situation and in a way kind of worsening the situation further. So the role of judiciary, as Professor Sairam Bhat has suggested, has become completely silent. There wasn't even a single petition against the lockdown, the way lockdown had happened in India, and all the anti-labor regulations and policies. Judiciary has kept a silence and taken part of side with the state and taken a clear anti-people position over there. And another option is kind of mass resistance. And there is again a bar on a restriction on mass protest and assembly, freedom of speech and everything. So it's kind of a vicious circle where the inequality, socioeconomic inequality is worsening further through pandemic, and the state measures is further getting it worse, and we don't have a judicial intervention over there, and the state policies is taking kind of completely anti-people position, and we don't have a possibility of strong mass resistance. So in such kind of a vicious circle, how do we see through? How do we proceed further? Being scholars of human rights law and being activists of human rights activism. That's what I was puzzling, listening to both Professor Sairam Bhat and you, Professor Sandra Liebenberg.
I see no other hands and questions. Probably in the interest of time, it's already 1.5 hours now. I'll just add one more question from Professor Sandra's presentation. You mentioned about the international assistance and cooperation, which is also a mandate in many of the international covenants. And we know that with regard to the vaccine development, many countries are racing against each other, like for example, Russia and US. And how do you see this being a benefit to the whole of humanity when it comes to international assistance and cooperation between countries that are at the forefront? Because it has to be a benefit for the whole world's population. So how do you visualize the benefit of the vaccine getting to the whole population of the world? And Anju Rajan has a question to Professor Sandra. What all measures are taken by the South African government to provide positive right to unorganized sectors? Yes.
Shall I go then, Ruben, to answer those questions?
Yes, there are no other questions. You have all the questions now. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. So thanks very much for those excellent questions. So on the question of available resources, our committee, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, has now been making a project and looking at this question already for the past 2 or 3 years. And traditionally, the concept of available resources implies that this is a shield for the state to raise a defense against their progress in realizing economic and social rights. But the committee also interprets interprets this as a sword to say that states also have duties to mobilize the maximum available resources to realize economic and social rights. So in our questions to state parties in their reports, we would ask, for example, we would look at outcome indicators on poverty and inequality. We would then look at how resources are mobilized. So what is the tax policy of the country? Do they have a regressive or a progressive tax system? We would look at issues such as, you know, illicit financial flows, wastage of resources through corruption or maladministration. And then we would look at sort of social expenditure as a proportion of the public budget and of GDP. And we would set that. And I think there's, you know, that's been done internationally. We still see many domestic courts, including our own, being very deferential because of separation of powers concerns to go into this. But our own courts have started to make some moves in this direction to say that where there are clear obligations, then it's not an excuse for government to say they haven't budgeted for example, primary school nutrition or alternative housing if you are evicted. So I think there are, you know, developments on sort of adjudicating and setting standards for available resources, and also a lot of political mobilization around looking at the question of available resources. Unfortunately, and I don't know what the case is in India, during the COVID pandemic, there's been a lot of relief measures, but it's sort of subsequently come to light that there's been systemic corruption in many of these measures, particularly in procurement systems for critical, you know, PPE and so forth. And this has been, you know, a major issue that's been sort of, yeah, investigated. And, you know, we haven't spoken much about corruption, but that's sort of, you know, one major area where resources meant for the poorest are actually being squandered. So I think there is a lot of important work happening there. Irati's very interesting question of the inequalities and, you know, that have been aggravated, as she says, by the pandemic on the poorest, and how do we now get out of that in an era where the traditional tools of social mobilization are not available to us. So I think on one level I would respond to say, I mean, I think the pandemic has really also highlighted that it can't be business as usual. I mean, prior to the pandemic, we've had a growing body of literature of which, you know, Thomas Piketty has been the most prominent figure, that these wealth inequalities are just completely unsustainable and can't continue. But I think the pandemic has really sort of, you know, made us sort of realize and hopefully created some momentum in that direction. And you do see quite innovative stimulus packages and, you know, governments, even the US, paying wages to workers and so forth, you know. So the question is, can we build on those programs, those extraordinary programs, to achieve long-term sustainable, you know, changes in economic and wealth distribution? As I mentioned, our social grants programs during the pandemic, there's now talk of converting that into a basic income grant. But the danger you point out is also very much there, that soon it will be back to business as usual. The inequalities will continue and have been deepened, and civil society will be weakened. very much, you know, in the wake. I mean, one can only sort of think that as the pandemic passes its peak and as vaccines become available, the traditional tools of civil society mobilization will come back. And also just, you know, the possibilities for digital mobilization are also obviously there. The UN Human Rights Committee, in its latest general comment on the right to peaceful assembly, has also recognized digital protesting as falling within the ambit of that right. So we will have to find new ways of mobilizing and pushing forward. But I think we miss a very important opportunity if we don't take the energy that's now being put into special programs and measures to push forward into sustainable programs, you know, to transform these inequalities. And then the question about the international assistance and cooperation and vaccines. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but the UN bodies are calling for example, use of TRIPS flexibilities to ensure that they don't become, you know, a barrier to access. And we've also seen the COVAX initiative, which is an initiative by a number of countries. I think at last count, there were some 159 have signed up to basically pool resources around the vaccine delivery and ensure equitable distribution. So really those kind of good practices, collective responses are going to be, you know, it's so much of the essence of international assistance and cooperation. And then lastly, just the question about how did South Africa respond to unorganized workers and the informal sector. You know, as I've already mentioned, I mean, this has been a particularly vulnerable sector, and it's also the biggest sector by far of our population. And, you know, also, you know, facing all the traditional obstacles, a large number of non-nationals within this group being affected. And there have been programs put in place, there's been social grants, there's been relief mechanisms, but I think it's not enough. And this is one particular area where a long-term strategy for unorganized workers and the informal sector, particularly also domestic workers, have been affected. So we've had a special relief scheme, temporary employee relief scheme, which includes domestic workers, including if they've been unregistered within the scope of that scheme. The TERS scheme, we've had that, but, you know, unfortunately, the administration has not always been what it should be. There's been delays in payments and also recent evidence of corruption in some of these social programs. So, you know, it's an ongoing struggle for us, and I see us as poised, you know, very precariously between, you know, using this energy to build back better and to falling back into even more of a deep hole of inequality and precarity. So it's really a challenge to all of us, you know, to yeah, as the UN says, to try and build back better from this pandemic. Thanks.
I can just add to what Professor Sandra has already stated. I think it's important that governments realize that they cannot go solo in ensuring either the public healthcare system or responding to challenges that are posed by such a pandemic. And I think that is where a public-private initiative should be encouraged. I think the public-private initiative will not only ensure a greater amount of a corporate-style structure, because it will change administration perfectly, but it may also bring in a certain amount or degree of efficiency in service delivery. And I think that's very important. And I think in India, we have slowly learned that, not only in the public healthcare system, but in all other systems where the government, like for example, the railways, we are looking at privatization so that it could increase or enhance the service delivery system. I think that is a realization, even now, the challenge of the pandemic is not that any government institute is developing the vaccine. It's a private institute that are developing, but I think once they realize that they are doing this in public interest, I think the governments have to tie up with these manufacturers or service providers so that public health systems are actually protected. I think there is a lot of lesson that one can learn. And I think it's important to look at, the fact that today, we are tied between two interesting dichotomies. At one hand, when I was a student of law, I was always encouraged to think global and work local. Globalization, liberalization was just starting off post, the WTO regime. But interestingly, countries, unfortunately, due to the political landscape and others that surround us right now, including the President of the United States, now is looking at nationalization or thinking inwards. I think that is a dangerous scenario. If countries start thinking inwards and they don't, they look at the rule of exclusiveness. I am different. For me, the vaccine is more important to my countrymen. That could be a dangerous scenario for most third world countries, countries that cannot probably manage, their legal system in a more efficient manner. I think we cannot abandon globalization. We cannot abandon the fact that, countries have responsibilities towards each other. It's not responsibility towards your own population, but I think it's a responsibility to humanity in general. I think nation states have to actually recognize the same. And that's the reason, I was just looking at Bangladesh, how they have been treating the refugees who have come in from Myanmar, especially during the pandemic. Now, Bangladesh is not a very, a country that has a great economy to, support the pandemic. But as a nation state, you would expect Bangladesh to take care of the refugees. And that is something that I believe that countries must pledge to. And I think that is where the maturity of its democracy and its legal system is better displayed. And I think that is something that the international community has to reiterate. I'm worried about the fact also that some of the international instruments, we used to always look at international law as being soft law because, it does not have that kind of enforceability. But I just do not want international law to become weak from being soft.
Thank you, Professor Sairam. We have come to the end of the webinar, and in the interest of time, we'll have to end the question and answer session. One quick remark or a request from one of the participants from Stellenbosch University, Elsa. She asked Professor Liebenberg to repeat the details of the report she mentioned that has just been released by the UN Special Rapporteur. If this is available to the public, if you can mention that, it'll be.
Yes, I could see if I can post it to the chat, but I will just, I'm not going to attempt it now because probably my technological skills are not so good, but it is the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty. He's done, Mr. Olivier de Schutter, on global social protection systems in the wake of the pandemic, including the subject we've been talking about social protection in the for informal sector workers. So I know the person who's asked the question, and I can send it to them, but it also should be on, if you just Google UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, it's the very latest report. And on that topic, I would strongly also recommend the outgoing Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Professor Philip Alston's report on the parlor state of poverty eradication, also looking at issues of how do you define poverty, and a critique of some of the SDG initiatives, you know, from very much from the perspective of the accountability angle. So I think both of these are very much worth looking at.
Thank you.
And just to also mention, you know, to put in a last plug, our UN committee under the optional protocol has now got a very growing body of jurisprudence on economic, social, and cultural rights, with some really important decisions dealing with the clash between housing and property rights, dealing with gender and social security, and many other topics. So I would also very much recommend that jurisprudence to the participants to show what is possible in achieving accountability for economic, social, and cultural rights. Thanks.
Yes, now we have come to an end of the webinar. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to both the speakers today. Special thanks to Professor Sandra Liebenberg, who has taken time out of a very busy schedule where she has started a new semester and she has afternoon work with the committees. We are so thankful that you took time to talk to us on this very important topic. And it was a very, very enriching session. We have all received so much of information and knowledge in this particular aspect. So on behalf of School of Indian Legal Thought, I extend a warm thank you and gratitude to your time that you have spent with us. Thank you very much, Professor Sandra. I also take time to extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Sairam. I don't think we could have found anyone else who could have better round up all the aspects of human rights aspects from India. You did a very, very good contribution to the whole webinar. Thank you very much, sir. We look forward to future associations with you both. On behalf of School of Indian Legal Thought, I also extend my thanks to Professor Sairam Bhat. And I would also like to extend thanks to our Dean and Director, Professor Bismi Gopalakrishnan, for facilitating this, for this platform, for encouraging us to bring up such events. I extend my sincere gratitude to Professor Bismi also, and I also extend my gratitude to Dr. Arati for coordinating the whole event. Last but not the least, thank you for all the questions from the participants and all those who participated from different parts of the world. Have a nice day to those in the other part of the world, and have a nice evening to everyone in India. Thank you very much.
All the very best. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye to everyone.